Good evening and welcome to Open Your Mind Internet Radio. You have myself, Alan James.
And you have myself, Stephen George. A very good evening.
Good evening. Now you might hear but my voice is a little bit different than normal, and I think I have man flu.
Yeah, so please send sympathy.
Yeah,
bucket loads of sympathy.
Loads of sympathy. The ambulance service is on standby, plus with a few nurses as well, just in case.
We actually have the two nurses in the studio as we speak. Both of them are just kind of mopping Alan's brow with a compact or whatever it is.
Compost,
whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, and the other one's rubbing my hand saying, "Now calm down, you'll be okay.
You'll be
fine."
okay.
Okay, so if I might disappear now and again just to blow the old nose, you know. Now the OYM player is not working at the moment. Unfortunately, the company who take care of our player services, they're having issues with their system. But you can click on TNS Radio and you can click on United We Strike Player and you can hear us there. I'm sure you can hear us now anyway on the player. So good evening to everybody who's tuned in. And there's more and more people coming on the chat facility as we can see there. So that's brilliant. Okay, so let's go over to the communication channels.
Absolutely. Communication channels are as follow: info@oymireland.com for your emails during the show and also during the week if you need to contact us. We also have the guest book on the website as well. You can leave a message in there for all and sundry. We also have the chat facility on the website as well. If you're listening to us on one of the streams, obviously not our own at the moment, but one of the other streams, and you want to join in the chat, just go to oymireland.com. Top left-hand corner, you will see the live chat button. You can click in there. You can join in the chat with the rest of the chatters. The chatties. You can also post questions there for our special guest this evening. And lastly, if you're near a telephone and you feel like giving us a call, you can
give us a call on 046 927 1212.
046 927 1212. If you're ringing in from outside Republic of Ireland, it's 00353 in front of that. And your normal call rates that you would normally pay will apply. No cheap calls, I'm sorry. Alan, I just thought I'd mention that.
Okay, no problem. Okay, guest on tonight, we're going to be bringing in Andrew Basiago. Hey, you got it right, Basiago.
You got it right.
We're going to be bringing Andrew in shortly. He was involved in Project Pegasus and a few other bits and pieces, which is going to be very interesting information we're going to find out from Andrew shortly. But just as usual, just a couple of things that happened during the week, just to have a chat about and let you know what went on. The first thing is in the Independent.ie newspaper, they were talking about the banks offer debts waiver if mortgage holders keep up payments. Now, apparently, homeowners drowning in debt have been thrown a lifeline after banks set up a scheme to write off huge chunks of credit card and car loan debt in return for promising to meet as much as they can of their mortgage repayments. Wow, aren't they very kind? One bank said it was prepared to write off up to 80% of the unsecured debt, which never really existed in the first place, obviously. It had advanced to borrowers who are now in distress. Well, aren't the banks really in a good mood? It must have been Christmas or something that happened, or something else, I don't know. So they want to make sure that, they can sign off the credit card, 80% of the credit card debt, or whatever unsecured debt you have, because they can't really chase you for that, but they can chase you for the mortgage debt. Yeah. So there's an interesting thing as to why they'd probably want to do that, but there you go. So, Steve.
Yeah, another little interesting one here this evening. In the Irish Times, the health watchdog warns of a risk posed by mobile phones, I kid you not. I think a lot of people have been saying this for years, and a lot of people have been ignoring this for years. But a major report from the European Environment Agency has warned of serious health implications from a range of technologies, including mobile phones and chemicals in everyday use. Case studies include industrial mercury poisoning. Mercury poisoning. What's in your fillings and also in vaccinations? Mercury. Fertility problems caused by pesticides, hormone-disrupting chemicals in common plastics and pharmaceuticals that are changing ecosystems. The report also considers the warning signs emerging from technologies currently in use, such as mobile phones, genetically modifying genetically modified organisms and nanotechnology. I think we can also throw in there ourselves. This is, I haven't actually seen this report, but I'm sure we can throw in fluoridation of water, which we kind of go on about here. Also Wi-Fi and all the kind of the microwave technology, or as we sometimes refer to as microwave warfare. And that's also probably include the new smart meters that are getting rolled out. They probably come under that umbrella as well, with all of this new technology that can slowly kill you or cook you. I don't know. Alan?
Right, okay. Right, the other bit of news is that the FBI agents landed in Reykjavik, obviously in Iceland, without prior notification in an attempt to investigate WikiLeaks operations in the country. But Home Secretary, I'm not going to even, his name is Mr. Johnson, let's put it that way, found out about the visit and forced them to leave the country, with the Icelandic government then issuing a formal protest to US authorities, according to the island.
Best of luck with that word.
The island's bloggers.
Island blogging.
Island blogging. Now,
does that mean that the Reykjavik is now going to be on the hit list for the US? They're going to send some drones over there, some troops maybe?
Don't you just think it's unbelievable that the US government have the audacity to go and do that? And just think they can just go in and to somebody, into a country and do that. And just not even get permission, and we're just going to go in because,
Sure, they've been doing it for years.
I don't know. Well, maybe
it's nothing new. I think it's just maybe at this point in time, people kind of are cottoning onto it and standing up and kind of going, no. Sorry, lads, no.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, maybe Andrew can shed some light on that when we bring Andrew in about the US government, as he was involved with them there. Bluebell on the chat facility said, did you also hear that we had the darkest January in decades? Surprise, surprise. Yeah, well, I tell you, it was pretty dark for a lot of reasons, not just the light. I think it was dark for a lot of people from a financial point of view. January being an actual, a long month after the Christmas. Steve, how's your week?
My week's been fine. Normally, as you know, anyway, normally before the show, I'm generally at home, kind of stuck to the computer and just kind of getting a few notes together of what I've been kind of looking at during the week. However, my broadband is down, which is why I was ironing. Yeah, sorry, I was ironing before I come up this evening. Has to be done, ladies and gentlemen. It has to be done. But so I haven't been doing too much on the old internet. I've been doing other things baby related. But I did notice during the week on a couple of days, I can't remember what days it was, but I did notice the for the past couple of weeks there has been the odd chemtrail. I haven't really noticed a whole hell of a lot of chemtrails. However, 2 days in particular during the week, it could have been Wednesday. I think it could have been Wednesday and another day, I'm not sure. But I did notice there was a lot of spraying going on, and it wasn't even the high level spraying. This was kind of low level stuff. Now where I work, it's in Dublin, near Dublin City. Well, just outside Dublin City actually, near a place called Blanchardstown, and there was a lot of spraying going on there. Now that's kind of near the airport, and as I mentioned, it wasn't the high level spraying that we're kind of accustomed to, and we've been that we're used to. This was low level stuff. Now I don't know if there's a difference, if it's the same sort of stuff that they're spraying, but it was definitely visible. So it was. I think at one stage could have been around lunchtime, and I think it was definitely Wednesday. But the cloud, you could actually see a bit of blue sky, and then within minutes of this kind of spraying, it was completely gone, and it was dark then for the rest of the day. And I did notice, and I commented to one of my colleagues that when we were leaving, where the day previous there had been some daylight when we actually left the building, but on that particular day it was dark. Now that maybe that's going to add into something that Bluebell said. Maybe this is a new thing with some low level spraying. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, again, we've touched base with Andrew shortly, and we'll say Crown Copyright on the chat facility said he sees that Hillary has stepped down. Anything to do with the bodyguard incident? I don't know, but that's interesting that she has stepped down. Might be worthwhile, we'll put that out there and see what we can get any more information on it.
A lot of spraying in Wicklow as well.
Wow, okay, so there's a lot going on there.
Okay, well, I'm sorry, I don't really have that much to add to that, so I'd say, how was your week?
Well, busy as usual, a few things on there. Just a couple of things before we bring Andrew in. One of the things I noticed during the week, I was watching a news clip in America, and it said, it is now legal to unlock your smartphone in the US.
Legal or illegal?
Illegal.
Illegal.
Illegal to unlock your smartphone in the US. From the Library of Congress, now this is not passed by Congress, but from the Library of Congress, they released a new law. You'll be fined up to $500,000 or imprisoned for 5 years. For repeat offenders, maximum penalty $1 million or 10 years or both. Now, that's incredible too. That's for unlocking your smartphone.
If we can just touch briefly for anyone who's not aware, they may think unlocking is something like reverse engineering. It's not. Anyone who doesn't know, if you're with one provider, when you get the phone off them, it's kind of locked. When it leaves the factory from the manufacturer, these phones are not locked. All phones are completely unlocked, and you can put any SIM card. But once the manufacturer gets them, they lock the phone to their network, and will only give you the unlocking key once you spend X amount of euro or dollars or pounds with them. But what they're doing now is, what you can do is you can go online, you can use various different websites, you can put in your IMEI number, and that will give you back, once you pay a little fee, it'll give you back an unlocking code, so therefore you can go and get a SIM card from another provider and use that. But now, yeah, they're definitely saying that if you do that, it's a no-no, and they're going to lock your backside up.
Somebody's getting the brown envelope because, you know, you spend this money on this phone, which is now apparently yours, but then it's not. Because if you get it unlocked, then you've just become a criminal. So you go to jail, and the guy beside you in the cell goes, you say, what are you in for? Well, he's in for armed robbery. What are you in for? Well, I'm in for murder. What are you in for? Oh, I unlocked my phone. You know, yeah, I'm a hardened criminal. I unlocked my smartphone. I mean, somebody's getting the brown envelope. That's getting ridiculous now. So even if you buy the phone, it's not your phone to do what you want with it.
That's an interesting comment there from Crown Copyright. Smartphones such as iPhones, you cannot remove the battery. So when you turn the phone off, it's technically still on.
I wonder why they would have a facility like that. Yeah.
Glad I don't have an iPhone.
The plot gets thicker. Okay, and the last thing on the list is just, and I'm sure you guys have probably heard this already, about the High Court has dismissed a legal challenge to the government's use of promissory notes, ruling that businessman David Hall, he started New Beginnings, if you remember that, and then moved away and set up his own service, and he did not have the legal standing to take the case. Mr. Justice Nicholas Kern said Mr. Hall was not entitled to bring this case as it would properly be brought by a member, has to be properly brought by a member of Dáil Éireann. So to say every man is equal, no, we're not. Obviously, you have to be a TD to bring a case against the government. I've got to do with the promissory note. So who's in whose pocket there? It's kind of a bit of a giveaway, really, isn't it? But there you go. You know, I don't know. You know, we keep an eye on these things anyway. Let's say, if there's any news to our listeners, if there's any news or any links that you come across, by all means, send them in to us and we will have a look at them and obviously send them out or read them out. Right, without further ado, we're going to bring in our guest. Now, Andrew Basiago was the team leader of Project Pegasus, the founder and president of Mars, is an American lawyer, a writer, a chrononaut, I think a chrononaut?
That's what it looks like to me.
Chrononaut, and 21st century visionary. And he served in Project Pegasus at the dawn of the time-space age and was one of humanity's early Mars explorers. Wow. Now, Mars explorers, time travel, and everything in between. I mean, people are going to go, okay, you know, this sounds like impossible. This is mad. Well, let's get Andrew in and find out. Good evening, Andrew. How are you doing?
Good evening, Alan. It's good to be with you.
Thanks for coming on the show, Andrew. We do appreciate that you're very busy and you're a man in demand. And so we appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your experiences and what you've been through. Now, before we kind of get into things, obviously people are going to say, you're a Mars explorer and you've been involved in time travel. So is it a case that obviously you have been involved in stuff that the general public are not aware of? And of course, people who believe the media and believe the politicians saying, oh, there's no such thing as time travel and there's no such thing as X, Y, and Z. You're going to tell us the opposite. You're going to tell us your experiences and what you've come across.
Yes, I mean, between what the world public has been told that world governments, including my own, the United States government, have achieved, and what they've actually achieved falls everything that is kept secret under the umbrella of state secrecy. And my government has had, 65 years and trillions of dollars since they launched the atomic bomb project, the Project Manhattan, to develop a time-space capability. And in fact, that time-space travel capability is now already 40 years old. So I'm speaking out based on direct personal experience in 2 secret U.S. defense projects. The first was Project Pegasus, which was under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which began sometime in the mid-1960s. I was brought into it officially in the fall of 1969 as a 7-year-old going on age 8. And I spent 3 years in that project, and then I was out of government service, and I was brought back in the summer of 1980 for a Mars jump room project that they launched with one of the time travel technologies that Project Pegasus developed. And I was in that for 4 years. I was jumping to Mars or whatever planetary domain we were reaching from the summer of 1981 until the spring of 1984.
Wow. So they have this technology. Is it called the looking glass technology? Is that what you used?
Well, not exactly. See, everybody's getting, one piece of the elephant, and they're thinking the trunk is a snake and the side of the elephant is a wall, and so on, the famous allegory. Actually, the United States government had 8 methodologies and technologies for either sending somebody to the past or future physically, sending them there psychically in an enhanced way, or propagating a remote image of a past or future event. In other words, an integrated program of quantum access, in which most of those 8 methodologies, a number of them high technologies, were fully operational by 1970. So when I was brought into Project Pegasus as a school child, the technologies already existed, and they were sort of both fine-tuning them, and they were training the next generation of U.S. chrononauts. Actually, it was the first generation to be raised from childhood, familiar with the kinds of effects that the different devices provided.
And you said that your father got you involved. Do you have something in your genes or DNA or something that they wanted, or why? I mean, I can't. I mean, I'm a father as well as Steve is, and I know I wouldn't be putting my son in anything that could be potentially dangerous.
No, I've never said this. I've never made that claim that my father brought me into the project.
Okay.
He was in the project.
Yeah.
It's really murky as to why I was brought in. He was approached and told I had to be in the project. It's very possible that team members in the future actually identified me as somebody who had to be brought in because, of course, I've become the principal historical spokesperson for what happened. So my father had been involved in classified defense work going all the way back to the ramjet engine project at Curtiss-Wright in 1952, which followed the famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. by 9 UFOs clocked at traveling at 7,000 miles per hour. So most of my dad's engineering work from the time of his graduation from Lehigh University with a BS in electrical engineering in 1951 till his retirement from the Ralph M. Parsons Company in 1984 was on different classified defense projects. During that era of the Cold War, individuals employed for the executive branch of the government, the military, and the intelligence community were clearly either volunteering their children into such projects or allowing it or facilitating it. But I have no evidence that my father recruited me for the government. He certainly received me into the project and tried to buffer some of the negative effects of it. But at the same time, there's evidence that, for example, when he witnessed me performing non-ordinary things when I was a small child, that he may have passed that information on to the government, that I was going down into the basement and completing his thoughts when he was working down there. He once saw me levitate several small objects with my mind. So it's quite possible that because he was immersed in the Cold War defense effort of the United States, with the 2 major concerns being the extraterrestrials who began visiting our planet with greater frequency after we began blowing up atomic bombs, and what the former Soviet Union might do in the world, that he may have passed on to the Defense Department the fact that I was a child who was evincing non-ordinary abilities. But I don't really have any evidence that he selected me. I had experiences with him in the project, and also I did a lot of time traveling either alone or with other groups of children. But he was more or less the facilitator who had been tasked to work with me while I was being trained by others. I think in a sense, we were partnered in the project, but I don't have any evidence that he volunteered me into the project.
And was it only children that went through the... when you did time travel, did you go through a Stargate or something?
Well, the technologies included, for example, we were doing conventional remote viewing for the Office of Naval Intelligence. Then they began doing things like spinning us to induce out-of-body experiences. I did about 100 probes to subjective moments in my own future in a device that later became known as the Montauk Chair. And the involvement of that chair in Project Pegasus actually predated the launching of Project Montauk, which makes me believe that Montauk was probably a spin-off of Project Pegasus. And then we began to visit the past primarily, either holographically or ultimately physically, in the looking glass technology that you mentioned. The looking glass is more of a modern term for what we were calling chronovisors, which were the work of the Vatican priests Ernetti and Gemelli when they partnered with Enrico Fermi after the discovery of the fact that we can identify a residual signal of a past event or a potential signal of a future event, amplify it, and bring it into the laboratory. So I interacted with both chronovisors where we were watching things on a screen or in a hologram, or when we stood inside the hologram, we went to that past event and interacted with people as you and I are interacting right now in a kind of a real-time context.
Wow.
And then we were involved relatively extensively with different ways of physically sending somebody to the past or future, with the caveat being that we could only teleport to the time when teleportation existed. In the case of the Stargate devices, we were only traveling to the future, and there were several physical forms of time travel where it created a localized quantum field effect that didn't require a device in the past to get us back to the present. That essentially what was prompted by the device just sort of evanesced, and we spontaneously found ourselves back in the present. So during those 3 years, U.S. time travel was accelerating, and they were training us as children for the type of time traveling we would be doing in adulthood after being sent to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis after high school. And in the process of doing that, basically educating us as the next generation of U.S. time travelers, we ended up becoming that because the program took me very far down the rabbit hole.
And how old were you at this time, Andrew?
Well, during the first project, Project Pegasus, I first teleported to New Mexico with my late father from a teleport which was in Building 68, one of the modular numbered buildings at the Curtiss-Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, which had been a major airplane manufacturing center during World War II. And I know that jump took between Woodridge, New Jersey and Santa Fe, New Mexico had to have taken place between September 18th of 1967 and September 18th of 1968, because during that trip, my father took me into a meeting with Dr. Harold M. Agnew, one of the Project Manhattan physicists, when he was the director of the weapons division at the Los Alamos National Labs. And Dr. Agnew asked my father my age, and we both said 6. So to the extent that I was born on September 18th of 1961, we can date the advent of operational teleportation in the U.S. defense technical community from that meeting with Dr. Agnew. There's also an indication that teleportation was a new application in the U.S. Department of Defense at that time, because my father asked Dr. Agnew whether he had tried to teleport, whether he had tried traveling through a vortal tunnel in time space, as we had just done, to go to that meeting with him in New Mexico. And he said, no, but I want to. And I think we can infer from that they had just reduced Tesla teleportation to practice and were now training adults and children in its operation.
And it didn't, I know 6 is very young, but did any of this seem strange to you at that time?
Well, it was, when you're a child, you're kind of processing your waking life and you're learning a lot. And everything you encounter to some extent seems both new and ordinary as long as the adults around you are not alarmed and are treating everything as things that are just happening in everyday life. At the same time, you have that sort of that thinner threshold between your rich, imaginative, and dream life and ordinary things that happen to you. So I think when I look back at how I was processing the time travel experiences, it wasn't really like the waking state, and it wasn't really like the dream life. It was almost like a third kind of consciousness where I knew I was being involved in extraordinary things because the adult team members were often crowing about what they had just accomplished or sharing shop stories about something they learned that the future held or that had happened to somebody time traveling. And I just really, I think probably the best analogy is, in a sense, I had somewhat of the experience that children do when they're involved in combat. We had a rich literature of some of the Holocaust survivors after World War II. Your Jerzy Kaczynskis and Elie Wiesel's and Primo Levi's. And when I read their works, I see some of the subjective experience I had because even though I wasn't subjected to combat, I was being repeatedly exposed to the threat that I might die doing what we were doing, and I was being subjected to a great deal of subjective stress. So make no mistake, it was very, very trying to be in the project. But at other times, I felt, the metaphor that I use is I almost felt like a yo-yo on the end of a string that the child was playing with. I felt that somehow I was literally at the very threshold of emergent human experience. I kind of grokked that as a kid because I thought, my God, this is new, and they're involving me in this stuff, Yeah. So sometimes it was extremely exhilarating. Sometimes I couldn't even contain my excitement about what we were doing.
But you couldn't say anything to your friends or family?
No, I did, though. I went back and when I started my investigation, I wrote down 8 things I said to my 4 older siblings. So, in fact, their attempt to, I wouldn't say brainwash me, but sort of condition me to basically shut up and cooperate and not talk about what we were doing. In fact, I was in a spring 1971 meeting at Cerrillos, New Mexico, where the defense attaché to the project, who would go on to a very illustrious career, he was a former Chicago, Illinois area congressman named Donald Rumsfeld, who would go on and serve twice as U.S. Secretary of Defense, admonished us to keep the project secret. He reminded us that all of the technologies were sensitive national security secrets, that our country was grateful and that our family members, our fathers, were proud that we were involved, but that we had to keep everything we were doing absolutely secret. So we were actually sort of trained in dissembling, basically giving alternate explanations to our mothers, our siblings, our classmates, our neighborhood playmates. And I did a lot of that. But because I was continually having bleed-throughs to this non-ordinary set of experiences, sort of in the cult of intelligence, which my father was part of, as an engineer consulting ultimately the CIA in these emergent technologies, there were many times when I point-blank told my siblings or friends what was going on, and they couldn't even process it.
Yeah. Well, I can understand that. I mean, even for adults to process what you're talking about and trips to Mars and stuff like that, it's going to be hard. We have a few questions coming in, Andrew, but the one more question I want to ask you about your time travel, especially in the future, is obviously you're talking about timelines. So, when somebody travels ahead in the future, how do you know what timeline you're going to end up in?
You don't. Really what was happening was Project Pegasus was not fundamentally a time travel project. I mean, it was obviously research and developing different time travel technologies, but it was fundamentally an intelligence project. It was hoped that by getting better information about past and future events, the U.S. could engage the U.S. executive branch, including the president, his cabinet officials, the U.S. military, and the U.S. intelligence community, could engage in better contingency planning for present and future events. And so they were developing this arsenal of time travel technologies. But one of the difficulties, for example, when you propagate a hologram with a chronovisor, and let's say you propagate, the event scenario is the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 14th of 1865 at Ford's Theater in Washington. Okay. The question you have when you immerse somebody in that hologram, or you just look at the event by standing outside the hologram and looking at this form of sort of cubicle cinema, which is what the hologram looked like when you were looking at it from afar, is this the Lincoln assassination on our timeline linking back? Or is this a Lincoln assassination at some displacement in time-space where it's an iteration of this event on another timeline? Because, in fact, the quantum hologram we're living in consists of a myriad of discrete quantum environments. So when we call them timelines, that's not really accurate. I think the phrase dimensions is actually more accurate. And in those dimensions, both similar and different things are going on. So there are many iterations. I was sent 5 or 6 times to Ford's Theater by a chronovisor that was at the Cerrillos Cultural Center in Cerrillos, New Mexico. That's where they also set up the Stargate device that we were using to jump to 2045. So it's a cavernous room. And I only ran into myself twice as a result of being sent to the same location twice from the perspective of 2 different vantage points. In other words, during one of the early jumps, maybe the second jump among those 5, 6, 7 jumps, I saw myself over on the right as I was walking down a hallway, and I thought I was looking at a mirror of myself, and then that image of myself deviated to the right, and I realized it was another version of me. Then I experienced it from that subjective position on the right during a later jump, and I could see myself kind of stupefied over on my left, walking along looking at it. Okay, now what about the other 4 or 5 times they sent me to Ford's Theater? Well, during those times, not only did I not see myself in the lobby or up over on the side there where the theater was, but different things happened. So, for example, only once did I see President and Mrs. Lincoln walking through the lobby. During all of the other jumps, I didn't see that. So a quantum environment can only be perceived by the percipient, by the experiencer. And you may recall the debate that really hasn't been resolved between Einstein and Heisenberg as to whether the world exists and we perceive it, or the universe exists because we perceive it. But the bottom line is that the external environment, if indeed it is external to our brains, has to be perceived to exist in the mind of the percipient. So it's really questionable whether the hologram was taking me to different discrete environments or different versions of the same environment, a kind of a constantly morphing Lincoln assassination based on my subjective perception. But nonetheless, it was a different set of experiences. And to the extent that they wanted to use these forms of quantum access, as I call it, which includes both physical time travel, holographic remote viewing, and then obviously entirely internal processes like remote viewing, there was a bit of a dilemma as to how they could use the intelligence data being derived, because it was producing discrepant timelines of literally of the same events in some instances. The paradox is, and this is something I really haven't resolved, I have a theory of what the case is, but during those years they nonetheless developed a quantum access capability where they could predict with certainty, for example, who would be president of the United States. I think the solution is probably that events of great magnitude are impervious to being destroyed or not happening in each discrete timeline. So, for example, a U.S. presidency tends to be magnitudinous because of the relative power of the United States, its influence in the world. So for those 4 years, when, let's say right now, Barack Obama is president, that presence of Barack Obama is going to be there in multiple timelines because the Obama presidency is a magnitudinous event scenario. But let's say the first song that he and his wife heard over the radio after he was sworn in as president, that may vary. The small interstitial details of life can vary without any impact on the integrity of the quantum hologram. I think that's what we're looking at.
Well, I was going to say, what's the situation though with this time travel creating a paradox where you actually go and see yourself? I mean, is that obviously going to affect? Can you interact with yourself if you do that, and will that affect the timeline when you come back?
That's actually one of the most frequently asked questions. In addition to how your dad could volunteer you into this, everybody thinks because of science fiction that when you go back in time to visit yourself, you can become yourself again. And let's say prevent a loved one being in an accident, or encourage them to change their habits so they don't die of a disease, to stop smoking. If, let's say, they died from lung cancer or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. That can't be done because you don't become yourself when you go to the past or future. If you're at the location where you're placed via time travel, you meet yourself. It's much more like that Swedish commercial that's been on the internet, on YouTube, where the guy crawls under his kitchen sink. He's a bald gentleman, about 30.
That's right,
and
yeah.
He meets a 55-year-old bald version of himself.
Yeah.
That is what essentially happened the second time they sent me to the Lincoln assassination. It caused me to be present during that earlier jump, you see? And then I also experienced it in real time, seeing myself on the left there. You visit yourself. You don't become yourself when you travel to the past or future.
Well, that's okay, but what happens if something happened to you when you were younger, say you got knocked down or something like that, and you went back and you said to yourself, number one, you would probably be shocked to see the same, see yourself coming up to you and saying, don't run out on the road, you're going to get knocked down or something like that. That's going to change the timeline. Because
actually, no, it doesn't. Something more mysterious happens. When you're in the original event, you're visited by yourself. So the only information that can be shared with you by yourself or another time traveler from the future are the events that have already occurred, or that occur from that point forward that person knows about, just like in ordinary life. No informer is omniscient. Okay. Now, if you're warned by somebody in the future, it's difficult for that situation to be imagined, because they would have had to have not intervened for them to, let's say, prevent you from having a life-threatening accident. So, in fact, the gravamen, the pith of this phenomenon is simply this, and that is when you travel to the past and have retrocausal effects on the past, or you travel to the future and have protocausal effects, your intervention non-locally occurs in real time. So I could have been visited for myself in a more extensive way. Let's say now, if I was given access to a technology, and I could be told, let's say, that Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama would be three presidents in a row, and I could win a lot of bar bets and make a bet on that at Patty Powers.
Yeah.
But I can't be told about something that has to happen for the future to know about it. So there's no scenario where the future can brief you in the real time in the past based on something that they didn't interdict already, because when they intervene in the past, they're intervening in real time before that potential event. So if they come back and say, never travel to the state of Ohio because you're going to die there in a car accident, they would have to know that by knowing about your death. But then if they prevented it by traveling back to the past, the event wouldn't occur and they wouldn't have the data.
Oh,
so
okay.
You see? That's a paradox.
Yeah, okay, got it.
The solution to the grandfather's paradox is you can't go back and kill your grandfather, for example, to intermit your own existence, because you exist.
Yeah.
To contemplate or to take that journey to the past. If you succeeded, you wouldn't exist to either contemplate or take the journey to the past.
Yeah.
To try to do that. So the answer is you can travel because your grandfather existed, and if you have time travel to the past, you can go back in time to try to kill your grandfather as many times as you can go back there, but you can never succeed.
Right, yeah, I got it. Yeah.
It remains asymptotic to the event threshold.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, Andrew, we've been inundated with questions from our listeners, so I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to pass it over to Steve. And Steve has a list of questions that all the listeners have. So over to you, Steve.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. A lot of what you're saying, Andrew, I mean, the way you've explained some of the stuff there about jumping back and forward and why you couldn't kill your grandfather. And I've actually, this is going to sound silly, I know, but I actually had a vision, not a vision, but a memory of, do you remember in the film Back to the Future? I actually loved those films.
Yeah.
And when Dr. Emmett Brown, he's having a chat with Marty McFly, and he's telling him why he cannot intervene with, mix with any of his family when he goes back. Does he go forward? I think it's when he goes back, because it would disrupt the space-time continuum.
Yeah.
But it's amazing, absolutely mind-blowing stuff. Andrew, I'm just going to go through the questions. I'll throw them at you one at a time the way they have them here on the screen.
Okay.
Some of them are jumping back to earlier on the interview. The first one is from Kelt, and Kelt was wondering, can you please tell us about the pyramids on Mars? Why did the civilization there become extinct?
It's a very interesting question. The other half of my truth campaign is regarding the fact that Mars is an inhabited planet. And the U.S. began placing personnel there in the late 70s. So, I mean, this has gone into several generations of cover-up now. We even have a U.S. chrononaut serving as president because, in fact, Barry Obama was one of the individuals in his late teens and early 20s of my age. I think we're 45 days apart. Who was one of our chrononauts in the Mars jump room program.
When you, Andrew, when you say inhabited by who?
Mars has a primarily sort of flat desert ecosystem, but it's inhabited by humanoid and animal life forms, but at a lot lower level of life support than we're blessed with here on planet Earth. But it's an inhabited planet. It's inhabited by humanoid beings and animals. And in fact, I've spoken about things we encountered on Mars that we've now found in NASA's photographs, including plesiosaur-like creatures that are all over Mars. And in fact, we've identified different NASA photographs that show the same types of life forms as well as ancient artifacts. Mars is a very, very strange place. But let me answer this question about the pyramids on Mars. Mars was settled by Earth during the time of the great maritime civilization that built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. In fact, my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, has already published a photograph of a carving in a rock that the rover Spirit took a photograph of that clearly shows an Egyptian pharaoh with the conical headdress, the cobra ready to strike motif at the bottom center of the headdress, and essentially a kind of a blend of European and African facial characteristics, not unlike President Obama, who's of mixed racial ancestry, a mixed parentage. And there's no question that would be from the time around the end of the high civilization in Egypt, when in fact there was a reign of black pharaohs. The Egyptians were bringing the children of Ethiopians over and raising them in their, gifted and talented student programs, as it were, of that era. And actually, there's actually an epoch of black pharaohs. So we have a carving of an individual with primarily African features, dressed as a pharaoh on the surface of Mars. So the reason I bring up this point is that provides from the rover data what Hoagland, Barra, and Monk proved from the satellite data of the complex at Cydonia, which is the Cydonia complex mirrors the Orion constellation map that's in the Great Pyramid complex at Giza. So I think the important thing here is that to note is that the high Egyptian civilization had a presence on Mars. We could probably debate for 2 weeks whether the Egyptian civilization placed that presence there or that civilization first settled Mars and then came here. I think that was a colony of Earth. And the reason I believe that is that every year in the Great Pyramid, the wall beyond the head of the sarcophagus of the king focuses the red planet. That is to say that the image of Mars is broadcast or lensed through the Great Pyramid and appears behind the head of the king. I think that's a kind of a compass or an astrolabe that fixes Earth's position vis-a-vis Mars. We know that the two civilizations were in direct contact because there are quote-unquote high Egyptian civilizations like pyramids, like images of pharaohs, on both planets. Let me cite another example. I found an image of a creature that was half man and half scorpion in NASA image PIA 10214, which is I wrote my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, about, and that is in fact a hybrid being that appears in the high Egyptian pantheon. It's the goddess Serket, who was half female, human, and half scorpion. She's actually the goddess of the harvest, which is curious. So that civilization, which may have also had a base on another planet that got destroyed, called variously Maldek or Marduk, a sister planet of Mars, was destroyed around 9500 BC. And that's where we had the Great Deluge that's depicted in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Bible. And that's where archaeologists have found the flooding marks on the Sphinx. And essentially, that civilization on Mars and our own was eclipsed. Mars was, whatever hit Mars and Earth, we think it may have been debris elements from like a supernova explosion that tumbled into our solar system. That fractured Mars and squished it into kind of a more oblate spheroid than Earth is. And on Earth, civilization, which was a global civilization, was just utterly ruined. In fact, human civilization on Earth didn't recover until the Sumerian epoch around 3000 BC. So 11,500 years ago, basically what happened is Earth and Mars got hit by a lot of debris from somewhere in space, and the advanced civilization that linked both of them and possibly a sister planet was destroyed. And it wasn't until the last century, that is to say the 20th century, that the Earthians on Mars, or the Martians on Earth, namely us, reconnected with the other group.
Wow. That's definitely food for thought. And this, what's the atmosphere on Mars? Sorry, Andrew.
Right. NASA claims that Mars is relatively devoid of oxygen. But before Paul Goodwin of the United States and Andrew R. Steck of the United States, excuse me, I don't know if I said that correctly. Before Paul Goodwin of the United Kingdom and Andrew R. Steck of the United States found NASA photographs with a blue sky, I was claiming that the atmosphere that greeted us on Mars when we were sent there by a jump room was pale blue. It is blue because oxygen is present in the Martian atmosphere, and oxygen is a clear gas that refracts blue, just as the atmosphere on Earth does. NASA has and this establishment science has also alleged that the atmospheric pressure on Mars is only 8 millibar. Well, if that were the case, the size of the parachute that would have been required to lower the rover's Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity to the Martian surface would have had to have been the size of the continental United States. So they're lying about the atmosphere and the oxygen content and temperatures and the basic scientific parameters of Mars. They say that the Martian atmosphere temperature ranges from negative 175 degrees Fahrenheit to plus 225 degrees Fahrenheit. But every time I was there, and I was there for about 10 exploratory missions and about 20 missions where I was just bringing information there and giving it to somebody and leaving and jumping back to Earth. When I was there, it was always about 70, 75 degrees and quite comfortable.
So you could walk around. Okay.
We were able to walk around, and we were bounding a little bit more. But one of the things we're still trying to get an explanation for is we weren't bounding as far in our footstep as we should have been on a planet that is 40% of the volume of Earth. We think that this may be an indirect proof of the notion that both Earth and Mars are ultimately hollow. Yeah. Because then the fact that Mars is 40% of Earth isn't being translated through a magnetic solid sphere in terms of the gravitational effects, but has a closer gravitational pull to Earth because they're both hollow, and all of that material in the middle that would create, a greater offset in terms of how we would be pulled to the surface.
And I think that's another interview in itself, the hollow Earth theory and the hollow Mars theory, hollow Moon theory. Well, we'll pop back over to Steve and shoot away. We have a good few questions coming in there, so we'll probably quick fire them over to you, Andrew. Go ahead, Steve.
Right, this is kind of an observation to just come into my grey matter while you were speaking there. And the fact that, from what Andrew is saying, that the time travel exists, and Andrew has visited Mars, and now all of a sudden NASA has become interested in Mars, so they spend all this money to send a vehicle to Mars to send us back information. And I wonder, at some point in the future, are they going to say, guess what, we have found some information and life does exist on Mars, and they're going to start drip feeding us this information? But if they were, they obviously had to send the vehicle there.
Yeah,
because that's something that we can process. They sent, rocket goes to space, airplane goes up in the sky. We can process that information and digest it. They've sent a vehicle up there. But if they were to just say, we've time travel, we have a time travel thing, we sent someone up there and they've said this, nobody will believe it because it's beyond their capabilities, I think, to process and kind of believe that information. So I wonder, is this kind of a stepping stone part of a process whereby there is going to be a revelation?
Well, look at last week what we said. The Russian Prime Minister turned around and said, if America doesn't come out and say about the aliens and UFOs, then they're going to say something. So they're obviously going to something's going to break somewhere along the line, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, actually, Steve, that's a great question. I think it's what's in play. Essentially, what happened is 5 years before the NASA enabling legislation was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1958, you may recall that the CIA's Robertson panel of 1952-53, in fact, it was the Durant report that was authored by an astronomer named Durant, concluded that it should be the policy of the United States government to deny all claims of extraterrestrial life, but which would also include life on one or more of our neighboring planets, and to subject those making such claims to public smear campaigns involving basically hostility and ridicule. Now, this has happened to me because I'm revealing two of the most sensitive secrets that the United States government is holding. One, that they have an active time-space capability and have been traveling people in time for several generations now, for over 40 years, and also that Mars is inhabited and we've been sending personnel there for over 30 years. And I have been subjected to withering ridicule, and I'm a relatively distinguished member of my generation. I mean, I'm an attorney at law, I'm a graduate of UCLA and Cambridge, I'm a participant in two sensitive defense projects of our time. And so what they're doing, because they can't spend all of their time making fun of true claimants like myself, is they engage in kind of this drip, 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 de minimis kind of disclosure effort. It's kind of a constant machine that constantly makes small references to little clues that they're uncovering. Let's say regarding Mars, they declared, at the time that I was publishing pictures showing water on Mars, they made the announcement, this is in January 2009, they made the chilling discovery. They announced that they had made the chilling discovery of ice on Mars. At the time when we were showing human and animal life forms on Mars, they were announcing that Mars had methane and therefore may host vegetative life. Okay, so they are actively engaged in the kind of cover-up that you're articulating, basically letting out small pieces of information that allow the public to adjust to the reality without having to acknowledge that the U.S. government has been involved in a multi-generational cover-up of these matters. And that's, in fact, why I'm going to be running for president in 2016. I'm taking my Truth campaign, and I'm going to be elaborating it into a campaign for the White House, because I don't believe that the United States, which believed in itself as being one of the fulfillments of the Enlightenment, should be engaged in a multi-generational cover-up of scientific truth and of technical accomplishment. That doesn't make any sense at all. It basically creates two classes, the government insiders and everybody else who's perpetually kept on the outside about these truths. And I think it's interesting that after I came forward on mass media in the United States and now internationally, two of my fellow jumpers have come forward, William D. Stillings and Bernard Mendez. Bernard Mendez was an intimate of Richard Nixon and Howard Hughes. He started working for President Nixon when he was in his teens. He was under the Army General Staff when he investigated the Jump Ring Project. So he's somebody who arrived. He's somebody who went on a set of dangerous missions for the U.S. government over a long and storied career. Okay, so this is in fact what's happening. And so the original primary mission that, for example, NASA was given in the enabling legislation in 1958, which was to foster the expansion of human knowledge of space and the near-Earth environment. That goal has been forever sundered by the abuse of state secrecy. That's why I kind of analogize between the truth movement and the abolition movement. The abolition movement fought and overcame and ended the physical oppression embodied in slavery of human beings. I believe that the truth movement will evolve into an as estimable and historical movement, and it will fight and put an end to the metaphysical oppression embodied in the abuse of state secrecy. Because what's happening is our permanent secret governments are keeping humanity from the truth about the cosmos that we inhabit. And I believe that that's the right to know about the true nature of the cosmos we inhabit. I believe that's a human right. I believe that belongs to the common heritage of humankind. And we should be demanding openness from our government.
Well, Andrew, I think you know as well as we do that knowledge is power. And that's really what it comes down to.
If Andrew, if you do run in the next election in 2016, do you reckon you are in with a chance? And I mean that insofar as, do you reckon that see, from what we hear on a daily basis, and from what our research shows us, that there are kind of the men behind the likes of the Barack Obamas and all. And if these men, like the say who are in the shadows, if they want this information out, then you'd probably be in the running for president. But if they want this information hidden, then obviously they have the power and they can pull the strings that would affect your chances. So, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that's a reasonable consideration. I haven't served in high office. I'm going to be running as an independent, so I'm already seeking ballot access in the 50 states. So whether there's a seat change or some kind of alienating event, imagine there was a big payola scandal and it was learned that half of the Congress were CIA agents with Swiss bank accounts. Something very remarkable could happen, which would be that an outside or independent candidate could become president. I probably won't win during my first time out, but I can think of no greater platform for informing my fellow citizens of the historical cover-ups of these subjects that's taken place than a presidential campaign, because in fact, the quantum access that time travel technology affords has actually, I wouldn't say undermined, but it certainly has disturbed the system that's set out in the U.S. Constitution for selecting our president and vice president. And that is the fact that every president since Jimmy Carter has been given prior knowledge of his presidency. So one of the decisions they made with the time travel capability was to identify who would be president and then brief them on that fact. And I have personal direct information regarding both Presidents Bush, President Clinton, and President Obama regarding that issue. And I have indirect information involving President Carter. I don't know about Presidents Reagan and Ford because I just don't have that information. But I know that 4 of the last 6 were given prior knowledge of their presidencies. Not told that, look, you're a principal politician of your generation, you may reach the White House, but literally briefed on the inevitability of their presidencies. So this is serious. It means that there's a constitutional crisis in the United States that the people have not been informed of. And I'm a sworn constitutional officer in the sense that when I was sworn in as an attorney in Washington State in 1996, I took an oath of attorney to uphold the U.S. Constitution. So I see as well as the Washington State Constitution. So I see my duties as a lawyer, that of trying to correct what's happened and at least allow the people to debate what should be done in light of the fact that the time travel capability undermined causality enough to give future presidents knowledge of their presidencies.
But
that's not how the framers of the U.S. Constitution intended it.
But if they know, the question's got to be, if they know they have this technology to go in the future and have a look and either remote viewing or travel there, and they can say what's going to happen. We're in a kind of a global situation now where we have the elites doing what they're doing, massive austerity, people suffering everywhere. If they have this technology to see what's going to happen in the future, does that mean they've won already?
Does that mean that they won already? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Does it mean that we're involved in the truth movement? Does that mean that what we're doing is basically fruitless and pointless because they know what's going to happen because they can see?
Oh no. Prior knowledge of future events is just that. It's not causation. It's just knowledge. It's just information. And I think if you look at certain assassinations, for example, in the United States, I don't discount, for example, the notion that the U.S. government assassinated John Lennon. I don't believe it was just a lone kook. I believe there was evidence of CIA involvement through the wife of the assassin. So I think that there are individuals who, for example, are killed to prevent them from elaborating the rest of their life, from having what is perceived to be some kind of anti-government or anti-social impact, which obviously was not the case of John Lennon. He was a great conduit for positive social change and thinking. But I think that they have intelligence analysts who go forward and figure out how things fall together. So, for example, why haven't I been assassinated for revealing these state secrets? Well, if they have the footage of me cutting the red ribbon at Grand Central Teleport in New York City, they may be trying to, by not assassinating me, they may be trying to make sure that teleportation is adopted globally. Or if I reach the presidency, maybe they have the footage of me being sworn in. I certainly saw that when I was in the Montauk Chair as a child. I saw myself being sworn in, actually with my left hand on the Bible. I even described for them who was holding the Bible. So multiple timelines are at play. There's essentially three major ones in the life of any particular individual. So we don't know what they've concluded about different national security matters based on quantum access to future events. I know this. I know that I began investigating my experiences, going back and compiling all the facts around the year 2000. I did a major fact-finding trip to New Mexico 3 times. That was in 2003, 4, and 8. During the 2003 trip, I met with a number of people that had been set up through a liaison that I had with CIA. And during one of those meetings, I was advised by the Bush administration that the time travel technologies I was exposed to remained sensitive and compartmentalized national security secrets, that I was not crazy, that I was in the project and it involved time travel, but that if I didn't stop investigating, talking about, or writing about those technologies, they couldn't guarantee my survival. So I was essentially threatened or warned by the last Bush administration to cease and desist and not carry forward. I basically yesed them and then carried on with my campaign because I wasn't really treated very well by the U.S. government when I served in the project. We weren't even salaried. We weren't even paid for jumping later in the early 80s. So because I was essentially exploited in violation of the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which bans slavery and involuntary servitude, because I was subjected to both involuntary servitude and essentially 2 seasons of slavery by doing work but not being remunerated in any way, I had no moral compunction about telling the Bush administration that I was going to cease and desist and then carrying forward with my truth campaign. And I first spoke publicly in October of 2004, and I've been lecturing and appearing on television and radio ever since. I mean, I'm going to continue to speak out. Now, why haven't they killed me? Why haven't they warned me again? Well, maybe after I brought attention to myself in real time, they went forward and said, oh, we can't kill Andy, he's going to be president. Or he doesn't reach the White House, but he helps public teleportation being established, linking major world cities. Somebody has to lead this effort. The technology has existed for over 40 years. I mean, why are people still flying from Paris to Sydney for 24 hours when they could be getting there in seconds? I mean, why are we still subjecting pregnant women to miscarriages and birth defects and coronary patients to heart attacks and pulmonary thrombosis and so forth by sitting them on long-distance commercial air flights when they could be teleporting to their locations in seconds?
But you know why, Andrew. There's a eugenics program going on. And the powers that be, or the cabal, or there's numerous names for these people, but there's a eugenics program going on, and they want to reduce the population to 500 million.
Well, we have to contest that because we have a right to live, and we're nowhere near our carrying capacity on this planet. Especially if we introduce these hidden technologies, these potentially life-advantaging technologies that have been secreted, that do, as Buckminster Fuller said, they do more with less input of time, energy, and materiel. There's ultimately no argument to suppress such technology unless it is inherently dangerous or toxic. I mean, I'm not advocating truth about how to build a nuclear weapon. And I'm not suggesting a technology that's new that would irradiate or create chemical toxicity should be adopted just because it's the newest best thing in terms of efficiency. But where a technology is benign and life-advantaging, I think we have a moral responsibility to introduce it socially. We're driving around in Model A and Model T Fords. We're not taking steam trains between cities in our countries because better technology came along. We have to use the best available technology if it's safe for humans and healthy for the environment.
Well, I mean, I myself and Steve totally agree with you, and this technology should be brought out. And I mean, Tesla had so much patents on technology that we could use, but the trouble is, yourself, it's all about big corporates and about money and the profit, they make from, how many times have we heard people coming out with free energy devices or ways to, power your car, you don't need petrol, and they're either bought out or killed or they have an accident. So, and this is what happens, unfortunately, and obviously this is the whole reason having people like yourself on the show, to say to people, this technology they have all this technology, they're just not giving it to us. They want it for themselves because they want us to be slave to the system.
I agree, and essentially, governance in my country is clearly controlled by the Rockefeller dynasty, with the Council on Foreign Relations giving instructions to Congress and the CIA, and then the CIA using career intelligence, civilians, and career military to implement their intelligence operations. So we really are here in a war with the oil interests. Of course, the oil interests have not gone into these alternative technologies because they don't work. They've gone into them because they fear that they can't control the ship share to new technology. They won't be able to maintain market monopoly if they make a technical transition.
Yeah.
Well, I just think that there's very few offices left on planet where somebody can have a singular impact, and that's what I'm going to try to achieve as president, is literally push this stuff through, even if the Rockefellers hire some people to start taking shots at me. I'll just be more careful than previous presidents.
Yeah.
People are now criticizing John F. Kennedy for being assassinated. After all, Mr. Kennedy's only error was riding in an open limousine because he was achieving much when he was still alive.
Yeah.
And so, we can't be cowed by the fact that the great champions of our immediate past were killed. We have to put ourselves in harm's way as well as great Americans like John F. Kennedy did.
Yeah. No, I agree. Okay, we pop over to Steve again and we go through the questions there. One thing I'd just like to say before when we were coming near the end of the interview, what I want to try and do is focus on solutions and the future. We'll talk about that. But over to you, Steve, and if you want to carry on with the questions.
Absolutely. Yes, we have a question from Lord Vapor. This is going back a bit as well. And he was wondering, would you, Andrew, be able to expand on the Vatican musicologist who supposedly discovered the chronovisor?
Yes, I actually met one of them. I met Father Pellegrino Ernetti when he came to the Chronovisor array at Morristown, New Jersey, which was my place of birth. So that's a neat thing to think back and realize he was a guest of honor that day. And I saw him at the Chronovisor room in downtown Morristown. What we know is that Pellegrino Ernetti and Agostino Gemelli, who I believe took the priestly name of Pier Maria Gemelli, who were of the Order of St. Benedict. They were black friars, Benedictine priests, both doing research and teaching at a Vatican institution, the Catholic University of Milan in Italy, were experimenting with trying to study and find out the cause for the fact that Gregorian chants have remarkable effects. For example, they have healing properties. So what we believe they were doing, at least from different accounts, they were trying to develop a specialized microphone to split the different voices in the Gregorian chants. When something that Gemelli's father had said to him in childhood came through the microphone, as if a past event in Gemelli's life was sort of adhering to him locally, like let's say in his aura or reticulating in his brain. And they then took this finding to the greatest physicist of the age, basically the great Italian nuclear physicist Enrico Fermi. And Gemelli claimed until the end of his life, he died in 1994, that by 1952 they had a two-dimensional image generating device regarding images of past events. In fact, they claimed that they had recovered images of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. And in fact, I can confirm that that was recovered from the quantum hologram, because at the Sandia National Labs in 1972, I witnessed a 16-millimeter, about 20 minutes of black and white footage of the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus was a real historical personage, and he was crucified in an event scenario that was virtually identical to what the Gospels tell about his crucifixion. So they then they had two-dimensional chronovision, which would be basically, it looks like television. I saw a two-dimensional chronovisor image at a national security watch post in Flemington, New Jersey in the fall of 1970 when they were introducing us, the children in Project Pegasus, to chronovision. And that scene was the signing of the U.S. Constitution at Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on September 17th of 1787. So what then happened is the Vatican gave the the Chronovision, the looking glass technology, to the U.S. and said, see what you can do with this. I believe that they partnered with Bell Labs because I know that William Shockley was overseeing aspects of Project Pegasus when he was the chief technical consultant to the U.S. Army. And in fact, Mr. Shockley, Dr. Shockley, was the only adult attached to the project who thanked us for our involvement in the project. So I believe what happened, possibly under Shockley's advisement, but certainly at Bell Labs, is they elaborated the two-dimensional TV-like chronovisor into a hologram generator. Because after all, if you're capturing and amplifying the signal from a past event, a greater way of arraying it in the laboratory is not as a flat screen, like a TV screen, but as a three-dimensional hologram of moving light. And that's what we saw when we were then taken to the chronovisors at Convent Station, New Jersey, Morristown, and Nutley, New Jersey. But then they realized, possibly accidentally, I don't know, but when they would bring that hologram down on the stage around us from a crystal array in the ceiling that was generating it, actually if you drive an electromagnetic signal through an 8-sided array of bismuth crystals placed in the right angle of orientation, you generate a hologram in the room. It looks like a big cubical slice of gelatinous light with an event scenario going on inside it. If they brought that down around us, we weren't destroyed. We were actually suddenly placed in that scene. And from their positions in the technician's room where the laboratory where the hologram was being generated on the stage, they could then see us walk out of view. And that was one of the paradoxes of being immersed in one of these 3 and then later 4th dimensional chronovisors. We didn't bump our face on the laboratory wall while standing in that hologram like we would have if we were simply having a virtual reality experience in an advanced hologram. We would literally walk out of view in that time-space location that they had propagated. So I don't doubt that Ernetti and Gemelli were the developers because, Ernetti shows up at the back of the chronovisor at Morristown sometimes 1970, 71 when I was getting ready to be immersed in the hologram. He was being given a tour as a guest of honor in his priestly vestment, and now based on recovering pictures of Ernetti, I realized that was the gentleman who was a guest of honor that afternoon. So, like most of the time travel technologies, save the Montauk Chair, the devices that are in the U.S. time travel technology arsenal are of human invention. The greatest debt of gratitude, according to my experience in the project, would go to Nikola Tesla for developing vortal teleportation and Ernetti, Gemelli, and Fermi for developing 3rd and 4th dimensional chronovision, and then whoever was working with them at Bell Labs. But then ultimately they spun it off into a defense project. It was under the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and some of the principals included Dr. Harold Agnew when he was the director ultimately of the labs, of the Los Alamos National Labs. When Stephen J. Lukasik was director of DARPA, my father was a liaison between Parsons and the CIA on teleportation, and other physicists and engineers that were brought into a sort of a multi-dimensional time travel project that, as I say, by 1970 they had almost all of these devices perfected for time travel without injury.
Right, and whereabouts are they at now with that technology? Obviously that's up to 1970 where you have it perfected. I mean, we're talking now another 42 years. 42 years.
Yeah, see, I'm 51. I'll be 52 in September, and I'm thinking back, well, let's say I was to become president. Let's just say on one timeline I know I do become president because my father and Courtney Ann Hunt of the CIA informed me of that. I don't know if it will happen, but certainly it's on one of my major 3 timelines. It happens.
Yeah.
I would be able to say in my inaugural address that it's been 50 years since my father and I teleported from New Jersey to New Mexico. So where is the technology now? Well, when it was being developed in the distant desert reaches of New Mexico, where narrowly a scorpion treads. I mean, this is really far out. Adobe buildings, abandoned school sites, abandoned public buildings for towns that never exist, no longer exist, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
They were also using schools, a lot of defunct schools, high school and grammar schools and so forth, buildings, because I guess children would be expected to be there, seen there, or playing there, whatever,
Yeah.
after school. But I think now it's safe to say that they brought these devices deep within the intelligence community and military. There has been a story that recently I had the privilege of meeting Robert O. Dean, the distinguished ufologist, the former attaché to the Supreme headquarters of the Allied Command in Europe.
Oh,
There's
that's
been a major whistleblower about the extraterrestrial phenomenon and the military response.
Bob Dean. I think they people know him as Bob Dean.
Right, but Bob Dean informed me during a recent speaking event that I had in Phoenix, Arizona, that he was told by the individual who showed up at S4 at Area 51 and walked through a kind of a partition and was informed that he had just reached Alice Springs in Australia, basically the Pine Gap base, the joint U.S.-Australian base at Pine Gap near Alice Springs, Australia. So I think that the intelligence dimension of it, the chronovisors would be, let's say, in covert CIA offices. We know there are 13 major libraries around the world. I would imagine that real-time images of past and future events can be brought up at those locations and probably even inside the presidential limousine. You recall George W. Bush's comment, his impossible remark that he saw the first plane hit the first building on 9/11. Well, that footage wouldn't be available through conventional channels until 24 hours later. But I think it would be more sort of on a watch post basis in suburban Virginia or in the District of Columbia and other CIA buildings around the world, these complexes where they have vast databases and so forth. And then obviously the teleportation hubs would be at U.S. military bases. That would enable, let's say, the Secretary of State of the United States to fly from London, England to Auckland, New Zealand, and not fly there for 24 hours, but go there in seconds so that they're fresh to participate in some summit meeting or state visitors.
Yeah, I tell you, it's incredible technology. It's fantastic to hear about it. We'll just go over to Steve again. Steve, you have a couple of more questions.
I do actually, yes. Just what you were talking about there, about when you were saying how far has time travel come, and this is something I joked about earlier on the chat room, and we had a little bit of a skit going on about the Apple devices, the iPhone, the iPod, the iPad, and we were just kind of saying, the next thing will be the iTravel, where you'll be like Starship Enterprise. You'll just kind of tap into where you want to go, where you want to beam to, and you'll be there. Yes.
Well, that could be a possibility. I mean, if you think like 40 odd years since the 1970s, I mean, Andrew, is that a possibility where, I mean, we couldn't. Years ago, we couldn't envisage the idea of Star Trek where they had this thing in their hand and they could communicate to somebody, around the world or up to the U.S. Enterprise, and we thought, that's fascinating. But now we have it. It's a mobile phone. So
right. Mm-hmm.
Is there a possibility that they will be developing technology where they'll be able to do such a thing?
Well, on Project Pegasus, there was a handheld chronovisor. My father and his longtime friend, Mary Constance Chavez, and I walked outside of Old Town Albuquerque, and we knew that complex had been there since 1706, where the San Felipe de Neri Church is in Old Town Albuquerque, New Mexico. So we walked up Central Avenue, and my dad turned on the device, and we walked in in 1971, my dad set it 40 years in the past, holding this device, and we walked into 1931 in Old Town Albuquerque, and it was like a small town in the Old West. And that was only 3 years after Connie's birth in Old Town, and she said, my God, I was born in the Old West. But it basically created sort of like a bubble effect. We even went in and sat at a saloon, and my dad and Connie had beers. So like fourth dimensional chronovision in general, you're actually physically there, and you can drink things and eat things and so forth.
Wow.
I want to mention this issue about technology, because people would say, well, how is it then if these remain secret technologies, the U.S. government is permitting Andy to talk about these things? I'd just like to revisit that issue briefly.
Okay.
Obviously, we could have virtual or quantum holidays with that kind of device. I think we wouldn't want to allow mass time travel by the mass public because that would create mass chaos on mass timelines, right? That could literally cause some kind of chaotic function to go on at least in our little part of time space. Similarly, we wouldn't want unregulated use of chronovision because it would be the end of privacy for all people living alive or to be born in the future. So there has to be government regulation of the private use of quantum access. I think ultimately we might get to some form of quantum holiday where you could go to Disneyland and the Chronovisor device would connect to, let's say, a device that's flying through the atmosphere, over a Civil War battle, something like that. But I don't think we would want mass intrusion by people of the present in the past or future. I think that would be profoundly foolish and maybe even dangerous. But getting to the area of why the government didn't stop me, we kind of touched on this, which is they're stuck in a multi-generational cover-up. And so what I think they may be allowing, by allowing me to come forward, is kind of like a Prague Spring around time travel. In other words, let individuals who were in the projects come forward and gradually bring the public up to speed about what we accomplished. Therefore, we won't have to go in front of the people and say, look, this is what we can do because this is what we've had and this is how many years we've had it. So I think then you also have to ask, what is one's own responsibility regarding the government function? I know that there's been a cover-up. I know that I was cheated of any salary or benefit for serving in these two projects. But I think the analogy is, let's say, to serving in a war. Sometimes when war has come, the only thing to do is to join it, because the consequences of not fighting it and winning it are more severe than of not fighting it. Maybe you'll have a good impact, like maybe you'll save one child in the affected country, and end up having the privilege of not having to take another human life. So life is complex, and there's a complex relationship between each of us as individuals and the mass historical event scenarios that we're subject to. I mean, somebody who ends up serving in a war and doesn't use their weapon and saves somebody's life, you could argue has an anti-war effect on that war, serves the cause of peace. So I'm not working for the U.S. government, but at the same time I know that I'm going to help create a better world if I help the U.S. government bring the people up to speed on this information. Because, for example, one of the greatest things we could do to advantage humanity in the 21st century is introduce global public teleportation. Even if we just use it for the shipment of food and other goods. We'll get all of those trucks off the highways. There will be no longer 16-wheelers flattening compact cars on all the highways of the world. Food will get to famine victims almost instantaneously rather than rotting at the harbor or being confiscated by the governments of those countries. People won't have the health effects, the boredom, the stress, the fatigue of long-distance air travel. And one of the major linkages here to the environmental crisis is that 60% of greenhouse gases come from the transportation sector. So if we can introduce teleportation as the new dominant form of human transport, that will have more than a 50% impact on whatever the human contribution is to the greenhouse effect. I mean, obviously climate change is very controversial, but I don't think anybody can dispute the fact that since the Industrial Revolution, humanity has been pouring an exponential amount of carbon emissions into our global atmosphere. And that's got to have changes that we can't necessarily predict, probably for the ill. So I think that teleportation may be the most important environmental issue of our time. Going back and retrieving it from wherever it's being hidden in the U.S. government infrastructure and declassifying it for real-time transport first between major world cities.
Well,
let's start. Yeah.
I think you're going to have, I think it'd be great to do that, but you're going to have the same problem. I mean, if we go back to the Tesla technology, when Tesla was going to build that array to take the energy down from the ionosphere to give free energy, and JP Morgan said, oh, hang on a minute, we can't meet to this, so the investment has to stop there, and then it did. And I think that's the issue you're going to have. I don't know how we're going to get around that. Number one, who watches the watchers with this technology? And number two, if you have rogue governments or people like the Rockefellers and Rothschilds, again, they have the technology, they know about it, but they're not going to give it out because, rich people are not going to, and powerful people are not going to vote in a system that's going to affect them.
Well, true, but see, this gets to the whole. There used to be the belief that, for example, because they supported Ronald Reagan, the corporations were willing to fight a nuclear war, or had a different defense strategy vis-a-vis the former Soviet Union. In fact, the corporations wanted. I think if you polled any of the CEOs, they didn't want nuclear war because it's impossible to sell things in a world of radioactive rubble. So I think the analogy here is, look. Shipping and storage have always been major transaction costs of commerce, of enterprise, of economic activity, the provision of goods and services to buyers. So I think if I was to put together a committee of really brilliant corporate leaders and economists, the obvious argument is that if you can deliver goods or services to more people more quickly, with more convenience, less time and less energy and material and capital and financial capital, you're going to be able to deliver more goods and services and become more successful. So in fact, it's the mass corporations who would benefit. And by the way, not just the corporations. Look at a region like Africa, multiple regions, but look at the part of the world that is Africa. Imagine the increased tourism revenues if individuals around the world could go on a photo safari in Africa, pay a tax to that government for the privilege of photographing its wildlife, and leaving that evening for home. Tourism to Africa would go up by a factor of 10 to 20 times, because there wouldn't be the transaction cost of flying, let's say a Japanese tourist in Osaka to the plains of Serengeti. Okay, so when the world is brought closer together, and goods and services can be shipped almost in a time-urgent way, and when people can move around the planet almost instantaneously, the world is going to be brought together, and the world is going to be much wealthier. And existing economic institutions and governments are going to prosper as a result of teleportation.
I think the prospect of that happening, I mean, it would be fantastic to do it. Unfortunately, we look at the people who are kind of running the world, for want of another way of looking at it, New World Order, Illuminati, as I say, you put a tag in them, and it's all about control. And I think you're right. I think it's economies of scale, and I think it'd be fantastic to be, if you wanted to visit family in Australia, you just go into like an airport situation, you go through your customs, and you go through a jump gate and pop, you go through that, and out the other end you come out in Australia, and then, as if it's like an airport, but you just go through a jump gate, and you don't have to do your 24 hours or whatever it is travel to Australia on a plane, and that saves on all the carbon emissions and everything else. And I think it'd be a fantastic model to implement and to do that. But I do think that, as you said, maybe the powers to be are looking at this and saying, where are we going to make money from this? And if we are, how are we going to control it? I think there is a number of issues there, and as you say, getting a group of people together to sit down, economists and everything else, to actually work out how this could be implemented in a way that everybody benefits. I think it'd be fantastic. But what I'd like to do, Andrew, is we do have a couple of more questions there, but I'd like to start focusing on any information that you can give us on, future events or what's happening now. Where do you see the world? Do you have any news on what's happening? Do you feel that there is going to be a change? America, there's so much things people talk about what's going on in America, but over in Europe we're suffering from austerity, the banking issues, financial crisis, across the globe. What can you see happening, or what have you heard that you think might be positive, and what we should be doing?
Well, I can only share, and I have only been sharing what I know based on direct experience or what I overheard. Many of the things that I heard predicted in the early 70s when I was on the project have since come to pass. So let me just briefly sketch those, and then I can kind of explain some of the things that I'm able to predict for the future. What I know that the U.S. government knew by 1971, let's say, at that time frame, they knew about the advent of the Internet. They knew about the advent of AIDS as an epidemic disease, HIV/AIDS. They knew about the advent of the cell phone revolution because when they tuned in pictures of the immediate future, they saw everybody walking around with these little walkie-talkies. I remember that being discussed. They knew about 9/11, and in fact, my father and I were shown moving images of the 9/11 event in the early 70s at a future film processing lab, a lab that was processing images that had been retrieved of the future at the Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, New Mexico. Let's see. They knew the identity of Presidents Carter, Bush, Clinton, Bush, and Obama. Now, I was taken to lunches with the Bushes and with Mr. Clinton when I was a child on the project. And my good friend and ally Alfred Weber has commented, well, Andy, maybe that was an acclamation to the presidency. Because then in 1980, you have your father and Courtney Hunt of the CIA predicting that you're going to be a U.S. president. Now, let me share with you not what my father said, because he just said it once, and he was obviously my father, and so was biased about the likelihood that I reached that high office. I asked Courtney Hunt 3 times around 2000 whether I would reach the presidency of the United States, and the first time he said, yes, but I don't know how you get there. The second time, about a month later in 2000, I brought this question up again in another phone call to his house, and he said, no, not exactly, but you're on the scene. And then the third time he said, have you been briefed on 2015? In later conversations about 2015, and I'll even frame this in a predictive way, Hunt talked about the fact that there's a great disaffection by the American people from their government in 2015. I believe what he was describing was a payola scandal. There's so much corruption in Washington that when we talk about the influence of lobbying, we're ignoring things like whether members of Congress are being given information about what stocks to invest in based on inside information, whether some of them actually have Swiss bank accounts to take bribes. Bribes from who? Well, how about from the CIA? So one thing I'm virtually willing to predict is that by the time of the next election, there will be chaotic circumstances in the U.S. relative to politics, not a great social disintegration, but the American people will be angry to the point of revolution regarding the corruption of their government. I know I'm running in 2016. That's both a real-time that's both a real-time decision that I've made, and it relates back to what I told. And I'm not just purporting this information to become president. I'm telling the truth about what I was told about the presidency because it's the truth. In other words, I'm sharing what I learned on the project rather than maintaining secrecy to confer an advantage to myself by doing so. I think it's clear that on one of the major timelines there was a global coastal flooding event. That was the effects of which we saw during that November 5th, 1971 Chronovisor probe to this year, to the year 2013, in which I saw, actually I was immersed in fresh water so that when in my crystal helmet and time-space suit that they had furnished me, I was actually underwater looking at the U.S. Supreme Court building under about 100 feet of brackish water. So the global coastal flooding event that was predicted by Andrew Marshall of the Pentagon, and that would be a potential outcome of the scenario that Art Bell and Whitley Strieber write about in their book, The Coming Global Superstorm, is an intelligence finding that was made with the Chronovisor in the fall of 71. I was in that probe, or on that probe. But I hasten to add that the previous summer, time travel to the past had been dispensed with about using chronovisors because the chronovisor was always sending us to a slightly different version of the past. So I think we can infer from that we don't have to have a global coastal flooding event in 2013, but it was certainly something that was more possible than people realized because it's on one of the major timelines.
Wow.
I can also say by going to 2045, I believe on this timeline, because that's when I was ferrying back the microfilm summaries of events occurring between the mid-1970s and the mid-2040s, 2045.
Yeah.
That conditions there reached an almost steady state kind of sustainable city kind of paradigm. So I think it's hopeful to know that at least in some parts of the world, a kind of a sustainable city sort of reality exists where the natural and the built environments have been brought into an unprecedented kind of harmony. So the sustainability movement is going to grow, and while there'll be more congestion in cities, there'll be more of a greening of cities. And that thinking and that inventiveness is already taking place. It sort of emerged in the 1990s, and it's still growing, and it's going to have a bigger impact on people than they realize. I mean, imagine sitting on a park bench and realizing you're sitting on plant growth that's adhering to the park bench. I mean, we're going to make our cities greener.
Yeah.
We're going to have roads that will abate the danger of urban runoff-related flooding by being absolutely porous. They'll be strong enough to drive a truck on if we don't adopt teleportation, but they'll be permeable enough to capture rainwater for water catchment and for flood control. So there's going to be a lot of developments in urbanism that are going to make urban living much more commodious for human beings, and I think that's a hopeful trend that we're going to see.
That's an incredible if that's going to happen. Excuse me. Right, I'll tell you what we're going to do, Andrew. We have a few questions in, so we're going to quick fire them over to you. If you can kind of give us a sentence or two on each question, that would be fantastic in answer. All right, Steve.
Okay, just before we do that, I mean, I'm having a vision in my head of a piece of electrical cable, and on that electrical cable there are millions and billions of wires inside it, and I'm just wondering that, would it be possible, Andrew, that maybe when you jump, say, from the 1970s to 2045, the vision of the future that you witnessed, would that be only on your timeline, or would that be on let's say, all those billions and billions of wires in this piece of cable, if you like, would that be the same future for all of those other people? If they were to jump forward to 2045, would they be experiencing the same future that you would have experienced?
Well, actually, everybody lives only in a semi-overlapping environment all the time. So imagine that imagine that a college friend meets their friend on the college campus, just crossing between classes or whatever, and they have a conversation. One person is standing there from their perspective, the other person is standing from their perspective. Let's say a third friend comes over to them and starts talking with them, and one peels off, and then the two that remain continue the conversation. That's what's going on all the time. Each of us essentially lives in our slice of the quantum hologram. We live on our vector and our relative time-space location from our birth until our death, and then we're out of the hologram. We exit the hologram. So in that sense, we only inhabit a semi-overlapping universe. Now, what I found when I went back to my kindergarten classmates and I interviewed peers and neighbors and so forth all the way forward to the present, is that the more time that passed, the more discrepancy there was between our relative accounts of shared experience. It's almost the mathematical principle that because you're not fully on the same vector to begin with, that there's a separation over time that can become a total separation from the shared experience. The person will say, well, gee, I wish I had that experience with you, but I didn't go to that college. I wish I'd had that conversation with you, Andy, but I didn't go to UC San Diego. I went to the University of California at Berkeley. And I'm saying, well, my memories place you in my dorm, you know? Okay, so these are some of the kinds of paradoxes of experience. And again, this goes to the Einstein-Heisenberg dilemma. Are we living in a universe that we can perceive inside our head, or is the universe in our head? Okay? So that's always the case. So when I talk about something that's predictive about the future, about me going there, I always say it in this form. I always say, during my trip to 2045, the place I visited was a beautiful environment. I don't know whether I would have had the same experience if they used a different device to send me to 2045 or somebody else was sent.
So what you're saying, it's subjective, really.
I'm saying that reality is our perception of a discrete timeline. It's always germane to the recipient, to the experiencer.
Yeah.
But yet, I know from everything I was able to glean from what I experienced and what I was told in Project Pegasus, that by the time I left Project Pegasus as an 11-year-old in 1972 and went on to my ordinary life of being brought back into the jump room program in 1980, 8 years later, that they had, with all of their different forms of quantum access, both sending people in time, propagating holograms, and just using psychics, that they were able to predict, for example, future national leaders. You know, for example, the chronovisors were always getting a different slice of the quantum hologram. But when you amplified somebody's psychic performance in the Montauk Chair, so that you enabled their visit to their own future, so that it didn't just seem like a kind of an intuition that they might someday be living in Seattle, Washington, but actually put them in that chair and brought their mind forward in time 30 years into the future by the time they are living in Seattle, that some of the time travel technologies literally enabled they had a predictive impact on sampling the quantum hologram. So with all of these devices and methods being used with different individuals at different times, people who were, let's say, very high IQ or very psychic or very imaginative, they ultimately developed a U.S. time travel arsenal that delivered a predictive model of the future. So, one of the funny things, kind of a very common thing that people are bringing to me is they said, until you brought your information forward publicly, I knew that there was an aspect of our modern political leadership class in which it was being stage managed. And I always thought, oh, well, here they've groomed this young black man named Barack Obama, and now they're setting him up as president and so forth. But then they say, now I understand what's going on. What we're seeing is often very stagey behavior when they know what the impact, or they've had prior knowledge of the crisis they're dealing with. We're getting speeches sometimes that have been canned years in advance. In other words, people were picking up on the artificiality of some of the state behavior, the leadership class behavior. Because, and this is a major point of my work, they are living in a nonlinear reality. In other words, when a crisis is placed into President Obama's morning presidential daily brief by his naval attaché, they may say something like, you may have seen this in some of your briefing documents 10 years ago. Or you may remember that paper we had you read about economic development in Latin America back, when you first started to be briefed 30 years ago. In other words, the chief executives of at least of my country, and presumably other major countries, they're living in a world when they serve, things are happening in real time that in some cases they were briefed about years ago. So that led to the artificiality that some people were picking up and saying, God, sometimes I wonder whether even the television news is real and whether it's some kind of stage play that's been scripted and acted, because what they're saying is so phony, and yet often it's so calculated in real time to have different sort of, psycho-guerrilla warfare effects, basically propagandist effects. And that's because they're dealing with prior knowledge of future events. That creates a kind of a staginess sometime when they try to handle the event in real time. They'll say something like, if they know that their action is going to cause a certain outcome, they'll often include predictive clues in the original statement, so they look virtually omniscient. They'll look like the most brilliant president of all time, you see? But actually what they're doing is they're operating on a nonlinear basis. Who knows what sent John O'Neill, the FBI agent, on his search to prevent the World Trade Centers from being knocked down, but he was in possession of that information. So were other leaders. In fact, people were warned not to go to work that day. People were warned not to fly. Condoleezza Rice advised former Mayor Willie Brown of San Francisco not to fly that morning. Okay, so we're living in a situation in which the insider class is operating on a nonlinear basis with prior knowledge of at least some future events, and the rest of us are living on the traditional model where we can only process information in real time and make our decisions and shape our opinions as we go, sometimes or often after the fact. That confers a tremendous advantage on this class of insiders.
Of course.
In fact, Bernard Mendez, one of my co-jumpers, I'm sorry for going long on this, but he claims that Richard Nixon was driven from office under the Watergate scandal because he discovered that different billion-dollar fortunes were popping up around the world based on the exploitation of time travel technology. And when he tried to shut that down and prosecute the offenders, he was undermined and driven from office.
Yeah.
So time travel may have already affected the affairs of the world in that way.
And this is the concern that we have, that it's being used for sinister means. Hence why it probably won't come out in the public. but we need to expose it. Andrew, what we're going to do is we're going to quick fire these questions, but if you can be very quick with them, that would be fantastic.
Okay.
Steve?
I know we're talking about time travel, but we're running out of time here. Andrew, I'm just going to go through them top to bottom, 6 questions. Question 1, why are Martians in movies always portrayed as green men? Has it anything to do with reptiles?
Actually, because there is a bluish cast to the small gray ETs, and green men, when they were seen outdoors, they were frequently coming up as slightly with a green tinge, and that entered real sighting reports, but then was ridiculed in media and in the public just as little green men. It just was one of those social conventions. It received that tagline because that became a means of debunking. There also have been green children that have come out of deep mines and so forth with high copper content, but that's not the connection. It goes back to the actual phenomenon being rendered as silly or fictive in the public realm. But Martians are not green. There's 3 typologies. Ones that look like us, ones that are small and diminutive and have pointy ears and long heads and lengthy fingers, and then a group that looks very similar to the gray extraterrestrials, and they are not green. They're actually all pale, as light-skinned Caucasians are, because they spend most of their time underground, because Mars has a very thin ionosphere. And if they didn't spend most of their time underground, they would develop skin cancer. So the Martians are actually very pale-faced hominoids.
Okay. Here, go next one.
Next one, from Lord Vapor. Andrew witnessed Jesus executed on an upright pole or stake, not a cross, ? What does he think about this? And then Lord Vapor says his own personal thoughts are he believes that may be the case, but he's interested in what you think about either a stake or a pole but not a cross.
Right. What I saw was he was up rather high. His feet were maybe 10 to 14, maybe 10 to 12 feet off the ground. He was staked through the top of the feet and through the wrists on what we would call a 2x4. That wasn't the long, sort of artistically inspired crucifix that found its way into religious objects, jewelry, and into artistic renderings of Jesus' crucifixion. It was about maybe a 4-foot long 2x4 piece of wood that he was sort of hanging from in more of a looped way. In other words, his arms weren't stretched out fully. They were a little bit looped, and he was stretched down on that. They were stretched somewhat, but they weren't. He wasn't as taut across the chest as he's depicted in art. He was doing a little bit more hanging than that, and it was very horrific to watch. The pole itself was more like, I don't know if this terminology is present in Ireland, but we have this specific kind of cylindrical wood that we call a telephone pole. I don't know if that's what they're called in Ireland, but basically...
we have telephone poles, yeah.
I know you have telephone poles. I'm just wondering if that's actually what they're called there. But basically, we call that kind of wood a telephone pole. Basically, it's about a 14-inch cylindrical piece of wood that looks like the tree itself kind of has just been trimmed.
Yeah.
And the 2x4 was nailed to that. And most of the other details were entirely accurate, including the crown of thorns, which was a huge, bushy crown of thorns that had been placed over his head, virtually almost like a helmet, to include his forehead and even the sides of his face. And his face was creased with blood from that, gushing down along the sides of his cheeks. He was very emaciated. He was a dark brunette with a full brown beard, presumably brown eyes, although it was black and white or sort of sepia toned. It was hard to really make out his eye color. I don't think it was blue, though. I think he was brown-eyed. He looked like a European male, maybe like a Spaniard would with a beard, more than Semitic or Saracen or Arab. He could have been an Arab. He could have been a very handsome Jewish male with more aquiline features. He definitely had a very soulful face, deep-sunk eyes. He had a fit body that had gone more towards the emaciated stage. But I want to just add, I have new information on the crucifixion scene, and that is, I had described how the pole itself was thrust into the ground almost like in a patio area, because about 6 to 8 feet around the cross, there was the remnant of a kind of an earthen embankment that had been faced with bricks that had, to some extent, had either fallen out or been subsumed by the soil that they were holding back. So from the right, you had this patch of bricks, and then those bricks started to not be in place, and it became pure dirt. So what I'm talking about now, I don't know what we're going to call it, but the crucifix was in some kind of patio with a small brick retaining wall around it. It wasn't just coming up from the ground. And the two other victims of the crucifixion, one was behind Jesus by about 10 to 15 feet, looking almost straight forward, and the other was about 20 to 25 feet behind him on his right side as we looked at him, on an even higher hillock, looking to the left, almost entirely to the left. So there's kind of an irregular pattern to the two other crosses relative to Jesus' cross. But I want to just note that there was this strange kind of alcove. It was almost as if there had been like a retaining wall and a patio around an olive tree, and the tree had been pulled out, and a kind of a pole had been inserted in the hole there, and that's where Jesus was crucified.
I think we'll have to leave it there. We really ran out of time there, but you know, I know we've only 3 questions, but we just don't have the time.
3 questions.
I don't know if Andrew can answer them very quickly. Go ahead.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll throw all 3 at you, Andrew.
Okay.
All right. Question 1: what does Andrew think about all the John Teeter stories? Question 2: can you ask about your thoughts on web bots? And question 3: Kerry Cassidy questioned the veracity of Andrew's story. Not that she disbelieved that he believes it, but that Andrew may be under some form of mind control.
Okay, I think the John Titor story is apocryphal, and I question it, for example, how he has never come forward. There's been claims that he came forward and he had an attorney, and that seemed to be kind of like an elision or confusion with my story, maybe intentionally. He's not come forward, and the time travel device that he showed, or that was showed by his researchers on the internet, was fallacious. It was not any kind of time travel technology in the U.S. arsenal. So I believe the John Titor story is a purposefully crafted urban legend in the internet context. It was placed online as an urban legend intentionally. I was identified by Cliff High's webbot with his use of asymmetrical linguistic trend analysis, but I would add that the webbot is simply content analysis of everything being talked on the web at a particular time, and that Cliff mentions that 50% of the time it's not a predictive model. So if you're just doing a sophisticated 300,000 search term analysis of everything everybody's talking at a particular time, I think that's a great analysis of social discourse, but I'm not sure. And it's going to have some predictive function, because if people are talking about, water skis in greater number, that means that water skiing is going to be becoming a more popular sport, and they're going to go out and buy boats and water skis. So that's not actually prediction of the future. That would be more content analysis of the present and its present direction. And then let me explain my situation with both Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy of Project Camelot, because actually I think both of our positions are fair. What happened is they interviewed me for hours on the phone in January of 2008, and I didn't talk about my experiences in the Mars Jump Room program because I had not yet recalled my experiences, because even though my experiences in Project Pegasus were unsuccessfully brainwashed, in other words, I was brainwashed after I was in Project Pegasus as a boy, and I beat the brainwashing. I never forgot what happened. That was the early 70s. By the early 80s, actually by 1984, when I was brainwashed before leaving the Mars Jump Room project, I was successfully brainwashed. So when I told about my story of being in Project Pegasus to Bill and Kerry in that long phone interview in January, February of 2008, I think actually I spoke the next day with one of them. It may have been Kerry. They are now challenging my veracity by stating that if he had been in the Jump Room program, he would have talked about it in 2008, and therefore we can cast doubt on his time travel story as well. They are thinking logically, but they are mistaken, and I've explained what happened. They had even said during those discussions, Andy, you're going to remember more. And I was being kind of cocky, and I was saying, well, I've spent so much time on this. Almost a decade at that point. I said, no, I think I've gotten everything. Well, I was blocked about everything to do with the Mars program, including my training and my experiences in the Jump Room. And it wasn't until Brett Stillings reminded me of it on April 23rd of 2010, fully 2 years after I I vetted my experiences with Bill and Carrie relative to maybe doing a long format interview on their webcast, that I recovered the information about the Jump Room program. So I really want to say that also after I was on their show, that pilot for Shadow Operations called the Mars Project, Bill stated that the day after that they don't believe me, and then Carrie protested and said Bill doesn't speak for me and we haven't worked in 3 years. But I want to say that germane to Bill's position, that because I didn't talk about it in 2008, I'm now lying, and I must be lying about both things, or at least about the Mars Project. They not only have my account, but they have the account of all of the other whistleblowers who've come forward on the Mars Project. And I think Bill's position right now is somewhat unethical in terms of social science research. He's basically saying, if a whistleblower or somebody who's had a very unusual set of experiences is interviewed by me, and they don't give me everything that happened to them in the first interview, I'm not going to believe them later if they come forward with more information. And I don't believe that's a principled methodology. I think because of the inherent trauma and brainwashing that was used in these programs, that the mere fact that I was blocked about more recent information, about more recent experiences that took place after brainwashing was far more advanced, is not fair and it's not reasonable. So I'm going to be publicly challenging Bill in the future because, you know something? Everything that I've shared with the public is the truth according to the best of my ability to share it. And even when I shared my childhood time travel experiences with Bill, in a sense, I didn't give a full account to Bill and to Carrie because I was not in immediate possession of that information. Not because I made it up later. But now when I did share that information publicly, guess what happened? 2 other participants have come forward publicly at the risk of their reputation.
And we're hoping to have William on the show at some time as well.
Yeah, well, we all have different levels of academic preparation, different skill sets, different memories. Bernie was a professional investigator. I am a practical social scientist as an attorney and a former journalist. Brett has a little bit more of a free-ranging kind of mind. He's very intuitive. He's very technically gifted. I'm not sure he is as accurate as I've been, but nonetheless, had Brett not come forward, I wouldn't have been reminded, and I wouldn't have spent almost 2 years with Brett and then a year with Bernie Mendez. Having frequent Skype teleconferences with each other, talking about what we experienced. So the Project Hamlet right now is basically, Carrie's planning a time travel symposium in Joshua Tree, California, that she's not even inviting me to, and she's lionizing the Montauk subculture again, which I believe is fundamentally disinformational in its thrust and in the content that it shares. It's not all untrue, but it's been embellished greatly. And there's, in a recent broadcast of Coast to Coast, they were talking about time travelers like Andrew Basiago and John Teeter. Well, I'm a practicing lawyer who has risked my entire personal and professional reputation and my dealings, even with my immediate family members, to come forward as a real person, putting my name, my image, my appearance, and my reputation on the line. John Teeter remains some murky urban legend, and we're being spoken of in the same sentences. Okay, so this is a function of the efficacy of disinformation over the years. I'm giving a true account of the project in which time travel emerged in the U.S. defense technical community, and the true account of the way by which U.S. explorers reached the planet Mars, or some other non-Earth, exoplanetary environment that the jump rooms were taking us to. And I will stand by my account, and I will continue to bring other whistleblowers forward. Because at this point, another thing that's anachronistic about their claims that they don't believe me, or they believe that my claims are the fruit of time travel, is my claims don't hinge on my independent allegation anymore. Other people have come forward.
Can I just, sorry Andrew, can I stop you there? It's 2 minutes to go. Well, we need to wind things up. But listen, the information has been fantastic. We're definitely going to have to get you on again to do part 2, because there's so much more questions that have come up to ask you and talk to you about, but we're just winding down the show at the moment. So can you, just a big thank you from myself and Steve anyway, that you've come on, but we just quickly have to do the sum up there. So can you just bear with us for a minute?
You've got it.
Yeah,
Steve.
just
excuse me, Ellen.
Yeah, just stay with us there for a minute, and we'll just do the finish up on the show. So we'll be back in a minute. Okay, so that was Andrew Basiago on the show. Fantastic information to everybody, and we're so near the time now. We've to finish up. So very, very quickly.
Yeah, very, very quickly. I think we're going to have to. Alan will obviously get the information on Andrew's page up on the net, so anyone who wants to find out any more information will have it there. You can find out where to go and where the website is, etc., etc. The interview part 2 has already happened in the future, says Crown Copyright. So listen, thanks guys, it's been absolutely fantastic. Another one in the bag, brilliant show. We'll do it all again next week.
Exactly.
From myself, Stephen George.
Next week, next Sunday, we have Brian Gerrish on. We're going to be talking about the Jimmy Savile stuff and everything else, all got to do with that. So, from Alan James, take care. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.